Thank you.
I want something to hide behind. Can I use that? There we go. Thank you for the introduction. I always think that sounds more like an obituary than anything else. It wasn't totally accurate, but good enough. In any event, it's a pleasure to be here. And especially a pleasure to talk about probably one of the pressing issues of the international community today. And the fact that you're doing it in Berlin is certainly an added plus, because we have a lot of wonderful memories. Now, I've specifically been asked to speak on the impact of German unity on global politics and on the promotion of democracy across the world. In doing so, however, I consider it to be of particular importance to focus on the events that made German unification possible, most especially the mass demonstrations that led to the revolution in East Germany in 1989. For without them, without that uprising of popular will, and without that demand for democracy, there would never have been the free elections that led to unifications. Now, in the interest of honesty and openness, I must tell you, I have a rather parochial ability to do this task. I'm neither a visionary, nor a scholar, nor a politician. I'm simply a retired American diplomat who had the good fortune to witness and on occasion participate, even if minimally, in some of the events that led to unification. My observations are strictly personal, and although perhaps uniquely American, in no way carry official American sanction. Of course, the history of German unification did not begin in either 1989 or 1990. It had a long history of fits and starts. But with the advantage of hindsight, I believe we can indeed point to specific developments, many but certainly not all, political in nature, that contributed to the coming together of the German people. To be sure, the German question has often been described as unique elements. It's not easily transferable to other nations or to other peoples. Nonetheless, there are perhaps important lessons to be learned in the German model as to how freedom and democracy may be peacefully promoted. The origins of historic development are not always easily discernible. Certainly it's a subject that keeps scores of historians actively employed. But for me, the seeds of East German Revolution are directly traceable to the Eastern policy of the Brandt Scheel government of 1969. After years of a policy of isolation and sanction by the West, the new SPD-FDP government sought to engage reality rather than avoid it. And I would hasten to add that the Allies endorsed that policy, for it was part of the then called détente policy between Moscow and Washington. Nonetheless, in retrospect, Eastern policy was refreshingly bold. To dispel fears of a revanchist Germany, Bonn recognized the borders between Poland and Russia, and Poland and East Germany. It was a remarkable piece of diplomacy in that the Federal Republic shared neither of those borders. But it was on the subject of inter-German relations that the greatest advances were made. To assure that Berlin would not soon again become the source of tension, the Allies and the Soviets reached new agreements in Berlin on the access and procedures under which the Allies and the Soviets functioned. And under the policy of two German states, but one German nation, Bonn and East Berlin exchanged diplomatic representatives, and the Allies officially recognized East Germany. It was to be, as the Germans say, Wandel durch Annäherung, which means change through becoming closer together. And although this policy was pursued with conviction by Bonn, it was far from certain that it would have a policy destined to work. And even today, many people question the depth of its impact. I'm not one of those. My introduction to Germany as a diplomat, first in the ambassador's office in Bonn, and then at the U.S. mission in Berlin with responsibility for East Germany, coincided with the implementation of the New Eastern policy. So I'm able to assess American attitudes at that time. Washington was most intent on improving the situation in Berlin, and Americans took the lead in that negotiation. With respect to East Germany, however, Washington was most reluctant. We considered the East Germans to be the willing puppets of the Soviet Union and a flagrant violator of human rights. The United States was the last to establish relations with East Germany and remained skeptical of East German intent up until the revolution itself was in full swing. On my return to Germany as political counselor in our embassy in Bonn in 1982, it was clear to me that important advances were being made in inter-German relations. I frequently visited East Berlin at that time, for I'd been named the American negotiator with the East German lawyer, Dr. Wolfgang Vogel, on the question of prisoner exchanges. The changes there were subtle, but they were real. A chronic East German need for hard currency, for example, led to persistent West German economic penetration. That was done through the church, via barter arrangements, through hard currency shops, which sold Western goods to East Germans who had either family or friends in the West, and therefore they could get hard currency. And unfortunately, through the purchase of East German political prisoners. Many of the prisons in East Germany were full of people who just basically disagreed with the regime. And cynically, they sort of offered them up to the West German government at about 40,000 Deutschmarks a crack. And what do you do? And I think the West German government did anything. They took as many as they could. And that was a source of a lot of hard currency. Interestingly enough, and I don't know how many people ever experienced this, but the intershops in which they sold Western goods for hard currency, by definition, excluded members of the Communist Party because they were prohibited from having Western currency. Well, this didn't make the cadres of the Communist Party very happy. I don't know to what extent that had to do. And, of course, West German television became daily fare for millions and millions of East Germans, to the point that the East German authorities no longer tried to prevent it. And person-to-person contacts and visits increased dramatically. Nonetheless, it was presumed in every world capital that as long as Moscow fully backed East Germany, and as long as the dreaded Stasi kept control of East German society, all talk of structural change, let alone unification, was doomed. And of course, Moscow was the key. Ever since the end of World War II, it was Soviet power alone that drove the Cold War and held all of Eastern Europeans in thrall. Certainly, we knew it was not all well in the Soviet Union. Its economy was on the brink of disaster. It could not match the growing technological advances of the West. and increasingly bold dissident movements were growing throughout the empire, and even within the Soviet Union itself. Solidarności's successful challenge to authorities in Poland alone shook the foundation of the system. Nevertheless, it was not until the ascendancy to power of Mikhail Gorbachev that serious effort was made to address these problems. To be sure, Gorbachev's interest was not to destroy the system, but to save it. But his efforts to restructure communist society, called perestroika, and to open up intellectual debate, called glasnost, unleashed forces that could not be controlled. President George H.W. Bush has called Gorbachev a visionary, who not only foresaw a better world, but also acted decisively to achieve one. And certainly his tenure in office marked a radical change in world history, and indeed made German unification possible. But that was still to come. As I arrived as U. Ambassador to the German Democratic Republic in 1988, all this was uncertain. My initial impression on arrival is that little had changed in the 4 years since I'd been last in East Berlin. The Honecker government, although aging, still seemed in full control. East Berlin itself had brushed up a little bit in connection with the 750th anniversary of the founding of Berlin. The hard currency shop around the corner from the embassy was doing a brisk business, but the Volpo still manned the wall. And we knew the Stasi still were an omnipotent presence throughout East German society. Moreover, Honecker himself was still basking in the glow of his official visit to Bonn the previous year. And plans were already underway for a gala international celebration of the 40th anniversary of the German Democratic Republic in October of 1989. Once I began my official calls throughout the provinces, however, a much more nuanced picture emerged. Certainly the party officials kept close line on what progress was being made in the party, but church and university officials were increasingly open in their calls for glasnost, apparently emboldened by Gorbachev himself. To be sure, all were careful when speaking to American officials, but clearly something was afoot. The subsequent story of the East German Revolution, is a word I personally much prefer to Wende, has now entered the political lore of the German people. The open border in Hungary, the flood of young East Germans east in order to escape to the west, the occupation of West German embassies in Prague and Warsaw, the trains taking them to East Germany, the growing demonstrations throughout East Germany, culminating in the mass protests in Leipzig, Dresden, Poland, and elsewhere. As we then remarked in our small embassy in East Berlin, the historical videotape of the GDR was on fast forward. Hundreds of images remain in my mind of those particular days of revolution, and some are particularly poignant. Certainly, among the most surreal was the 40th anniversary celebration of the GDR on October 7th, 1989. The most honored guest, of course, was Gorbachev. But all of the other Eastern European party chiefs were there also. And I'd like to add here, the only people that were not Eastern Europeans that were there was Yasser Arafat of the PLO and Daniel Ortega, who was at that time the president of Nicaragua. Historians will look at that maybe someday and find out if that's interesting or not. All attention was on the Soviet leader, who famously uttered the prophetic words about history punishing those who come too late. I was the sole American to participate in these ceremonies. And the gala dinner that was at the end was a fascinating take on communism's last hurrah. The atmosphere was one of forced enjoyment, but the body language of those embattled leaders was that of those whistling past the graveyard. Following the ceremony, the diplomats were asked to walk to their cars that had been parked in the list garden. And thousands were organized and were crowding the streets in solidarity, theoretically, with the regime. And as I walked past, a loud cheer arose. I was confused. I looked at my Finnish colleague who was with me, and he said, "It's your bald head." So they think you're Gorbachev. That was an unforgettable moment in the spotlight. The hectic pace of change next hit the Communist Party itself. Honecker was forced to resign. Krenz reaped the revolt when he tried to reconstruct the old guard. The party was chewing itself apart. Then in the midst of it all, the unthinkable happens. Mass demonstrators breach the wall. I'm sure everybody here knows that. Maybe it's only too young, but it was absolutely electric moment. But it's not over. Modro, the party dissident from Dresden, becomes prime minister. He reaches out to the protesters and forms the round table of all of the contending parties to organize national elections to decide the future. Now the push and shove of a political campaign, something completely new in the GDR, assumes recognizably democratic forms. Still, no one knew at that time where it would head. Now, I didn't write this down, but I'm going to tell you something that we all were amazed by, of course, is what was happening on the streets at this time. At the beginning, when the Hungarian wall opened up, the cry was, "Wir wollen weg," we want to get out of here. And after a while, the demonstrators boldly said, "Wir bleiben hier," we're staying. And then later on, the cry came, "Wir sind ein Volk," we're the people. And later on, "Wir sind das Volk." And finally, and it started around January, Deutschland, Einheit, Vaterland, Germany, whatever. That told us more than many of the other things that went on. I'm supposed to speak up. I'm sorry, I don't have a bold and strong voice. In retrospect, one of the stranger aspects of the East German Revolution is how late the Western nations were to actually address the developments there. I suspect that most were so astonished by its pace and implications that they didn't know what to do. Washington's policy at that time was to make no statement that either embarrassed Gorbachev or pushed him into a corner, or could be used as an excuse by the regime to crush dissent. But by December of 1989, the West started to get its act together, still uncertain what to do. Bush met with Gorbachev in Malta. It was on a whole variety of issues, but primarily to keep dialogue alive and show respect for Gorbachev's efforts to keep violence at bay. Chancellor Kohl's 10 points was presented as a confederation of contractual arrangements. Mitterrand visits the GDR, as does Kohl and Genscher, and even Secretary of State Baker. But the East German streets moved faster. And by January, the numbers of demanding unification became very strong. And soon the election will confirm that the people overwhelmingly want unity. And now it's diplomacy's turn. Bush fully backs unification with the caveat that Germany remains in NATO. Bonn agrees, realizing that this is possibly an anchor that may appeal to Moscow if properly presented. It is also obvious that NATO itself would change dramatically if the Cold War ended. Meanwhile, the 2+4 formula was presented as a way to solve the legal problems of unification demanded by the Potsdam Agreements of 1945. Now, for those who don't remember, Potsdam was the arrangement at the end of the war where the victorious powers decided how to divide up Germany into different sectors or occupation zones, and to divide up Berlin into different sectors. They had all of the victorious powers at that time were given the responsibility to make a final determination on Berlin and Germany as a whole. So without the Allies, you could not meet the legal requirements for unification. So the Allies added the two German states into the formula. Therefore, 2+4 becomes the formula for formally eliminating the legal objections to unification. And then Genscher and Kohl begin what I consider a series of masterful diplomatic moves, assuring Moscow that Germany was so integrated into Europe that it would never again pose a military threat, and encouraging the Soviets to see the benefits of trade by shipping massive amounts of foodstuffs to Russia to alleviate the growing food shortages there. Gorbachev didn't, probably assuming he could not change things anyway except by massive force, and then perhaps not even then. Certainly any use of the military would undermine his efforts to reform a broken system and probably lead to his political downfall. The legal negotiations, and I only attended the one in Berlin, largely confirmed the political arrangements already reached. We know the final wonder of the dissolution of the GDR and its unification with the FRG, as solemnly celebrated at the Reichstag on October 3rd, 1990. It was truly a wonderful, wonderful act. Of course, by the time that unification took place, all Eastern Europe had already been politically transformed, and the Soviet Union itself was on the way. So it wasn't the prospect of Germans coming together that galvanized the reformers in the East, but more likely the picture of East Germans themselves boldly demanding their rights and toppling the hated wall. As we know, historians now are actively plumbing the open archives to explain what happened, and that's a process that will certainly continue. Certainly, I would not presume to offer a definitive judgment on what led to unification and what specific impact it had on authoritative regimes. Nonetheless, as a historical witness and a Zeitzeuge, this wonderful German word, Zeitzeuge, I would offer some observations. First, political isolation seldom succeeds. Nor, ironically, does active engagement, unless all parties play the game. But engagement at least holds the promise of change, if only by allowing the parties to get to know each other, building confidences, and smoothing differences. In other words, Wandel durch Annäherung. Second, over time, tanks and secret police can crush dissent only within limits if a dynamic population is determined, alert, and unwilling to be pushed further. Third, technology has transformed the flow of information internationally, offering different views and keeping people up to date on events. Indeed, President Reagan told me personally in East Berlin in 1990 in June that new informational technology would force the collapse of dictators. He was a noted optimist. And it certainly remains uncertain, but it is a new instrument in the arsenal of democracy and human rights. And last, of course, the role of adroit diplomacy is increasingly vital in the resolution of global disputes and in advancing the cause of human dignity. Now, I hope I'm not naive enough to think that any or all of the above will necessarily lead to success. Every problem is different and demands unique approaches. Indeed, with the possible exception of Korea, I know of few nations outside of Europe and North America where unification has had a direct impact. The South Koreans that I know had hoped to emulate segments of West German policy, but they ran on into implacable North Korean rejection. It's quite obvious that the North Koreans have studied the German situation themselves. And it is, in fact, that democracy and human rights are quite simply no longer only an East-West Cold War problem. Now a deep cultural divide and all of the North-South problems have become more complex because in the North-South problems there is also poverty, disease, and despair. In his inaugural address, President Obama eloquently addressed many of those issues by calling for outcast nations to unclench their fists and join in international diplomacy, dialogue, and comity. He realistically knew that it would take years, and certainly the response is not what he had hoped. Nonetheless, in an increasingly interdependent world, that call must be pursued with persistence and patience. To do otherwise would be to abandon the last best hopes of mankind. Thank you very much.